and welcome back to the Hannah Franklin podcast. On today's episode, I want to talk about how to choose a school for your kid. Before we get started, a little bit of an update. After today's episode, I am going to be slightly offline for a while. I'm going to be taking a short podcasting hiatus. I'm getting married, and I am going to be taking some time off for all things wedding prep, wedding day, honeymoon. When I get back, there will be a lot more content, but I am going to be on a short break. So we're going to see how much we can cover today because I have a lot that I want to talk about. Let's dig in. So when people start exploring the different options that are available to them for the education of their children, it can be very overwhelming very quickly. There are a lot of choices, and it feels like the range of options is extremely disparate. There's not some easy way to compare, contrast the different things that matter across each school, such as academic outcomes, student-teacher ratio, price point, this length of the day, the amount of recess and free time that kids have. But the deeper you dig, the more it starts to feel like even those comparison points are called into question, because different schools have different opinions on what even matters. Some schools don't even give grades. Some schools do, but don't think they're important. And some schools have a really heavy emphasis on grades and test scores and delivering off the charts results. Some schools emphasize how quickly they're teaching their kids things like reading and arithmetic. Other schools delay the onset of teaching reading and mathematics because they think kids aren't developmentally ready yet at the point in time when conventional schools start to introduce these concepts. There's a huge array of what schools think are important, and it can feel really overwhelming as a parent to know how to even compare what feels like apples to oranges, let alone make a decision about which philosophy is right and which one you should move forward with to guarantee the best possible future for your child. I think the question is simpler than that. And what I want to talk about today is how I think about the differences between different types of schools and the advice that I typically give parents when they come to me telling me that they're trying to choose a school for their kids and they don't know where to start. I think the array of different school options roughly divides into two categories, two types of philosophical approach towards education. The first is the institutional, large systems approach to education that the majority of the population experienced in their childhoods via either public school or conventional private schools. Most private schools are running a very similar program to what you are getting in public school. There are obviously differences. Some have more of an emphasis on a classical education. Some have a heavier emphasis on student-teacher ratio or admission standards. But for the most part, it's the same product in different packaging. The approach to academics, the curricular structure that kids are moving through, the set of assumptions around how a school day functions are all roughly the same. This model of education, we'll call it the institutional schooling model for the purpose of this conversation, is the default in most cases across the West and has been for the past 100+ years. It's what most people think about when they think of school, and it constitutes the majority of available options just by nature of public school being such a predominant force in our culture and in every community across America. The other category of school options is a learner-centric or a child-centric education. And the differentiating factor here is that the child is the base unit and the first principle from which everything else in the education expands. These types of schools can still have very rigorous curriculums and programs that kids are moving through. But the difference is that the school is not structured as a large systematic institution. It's structured around the needs of each individual child. A self-driven, child-driven education is typically very self-directed. There's a lot of autonomy and responsibility for the child. The child is given the respect very early to have an opinion about what they want to be learning about and to direct the course of both their day-to-day and also their broader education. These learner-centric education models tend to be smaller scale because generally it's easier to deliver this type of education on a smaller scale, at least when you're using a non-technological education approach. Technology is changing the game on that front. We'll get into that in a little bit. But they tend to be smaller scale. They tend to be more localized. There tends to be a smaller student to teacher ratio. There often is a mixed age group that kids are engaging with. But really the core differentiator is that the needs of the child are centered to the education, not the needs of the system, not the needs of the teacher, and not the needs and desires of the parent. And the curriculum is designed to give the child as much autonomy as possible and as much of a say in what they're learning and what they're interested in and how their education is progressing as is possible. When you think about education as a sort of binary, either it's institution-centric or it's child-centric, it starts to get a lot easier to divide the types of schools that exist into these two sort of branches or categories. Most private schools, most charter schools, most public schools, even the things that are more innovative and more focused on customized curriculum and academic outputs, I would still classify as institution-centric, institutional education. Anything that has the space to allow the child to be in the driver's seat and has a heavy emphasis on the child's self-direction and autonomy falls in this child-centric category. Child-centric education is a really big bucket. There are tons of things that fit under this umbrella, and this is why it feels so disparate and chaotic and confusing. Micro schools are often very child-centric. The whole point of a micro school is that a teacher was typically frustrated by the lack of customization they are able to deliver to a child in a public school classroom. And so they leave the public school system and they go and start a program of their own where they have more space to customize the learning that they're delivering to a child based on that individual child's needs. Some of the classic innovative schools like Acton Academy are extremely child-centric to the point that they don't even call the kids in the classroom students. They call them heroes, and they design the entire verbiage and metaphor around the education experience as a hero's journey. The teachers are called guides. They're just there to help the kids on their journey, but the kids are the hero of the story. Waldorf schools tend to be very child-centric. Montessori is a great example of a very child-centric model. Montessori is a great visual example of what I mean when I'm talking about the responsibility and the autonomy granted to a child. If you walk into a Montessori classroom, you'll see often 10, 15, 20 kids who are all ages 3 to 6 in the most standard Montessori classroom. And every single one of them is independently focused on something that they chose to work on when they walked through the door that morning. And they will alert the adult in the room when they need help. But as long as they're abiding by the collective rules of the classroom, of being respectful to other students, of not taking anyone else's things, of staying focused on one task at a time, they're allowed to work completely independently within those parameters. And Montessori has a very rigorous curriculum. The process is extremely deliberate about what children learn, in what order, what materials they learn how to work with, how they progress through the sort of progressive building of knowledge, one piece upon the next. And yet at the same time, it's delivering an extremely self-directed experience where inside the parameters of the education approach that's been developed, the child each day gets to choose what they're working on, how much time they're spending on it, what they're interested in, and they can build their whole experience around the things that are most enticing to them rather than what has to be worked on by the entire class of 30 kids because every one of those 30 kids has to be progressing at the same pace in order for the class as a whole to meet its academic goals for the year. This is another often defining difference between a child-centric education and an institutional education. How much space is there for a child to determine what they're doing throughout their day? In a typical public school classroom, usually there's not a lot of flexibility around this. There's a set lesson for every day. There's test prep that has to be completed because everyone's taking the same test at the same time. If you finish your work early, you might be allowed to read in the back of the classroom, but there's not a lot of room for you to be doing something else while the rest of your class is working on a particular lesson or subject, because everybody has to move at the same pace. It's the entire premise of the model. Whereas in a child-centric education environment, you'll often find kids working on separate things. And the emergence of education technology has really opened the doors of what's possible with this, because in a micro school, for example, sometimes a teacher is working with kids of varying ages, sometimes quite a spread. You might have third graders and seventh graders all in the same micro school. And in a traditional, sort of historically traditional one-room schoolhouse model, a teacher would have lesson books for each grade level, and the students at each grade level would work through their lessons and then come up and recite their lessons to the teacher. And she could work with each grade level one at a time to ensure that kids are learning everything that they need at their grade level while everyone else is working on their own things independently. But there are obviously limitations to that sort of model because there's not a lot of room for customization and adjustment if you're working your way through a textbook, or as it was called, a primer back in the day. There's not a lot of room to adjust the lesson for the needs of the individual child. Whereas in a micro school that sort of functionally is like a one-room schoolhouse with a mixed age range of students, you can deliver a far more customized education approach to each individual child, much more akin to what they would get with a one-on-one tutor than they would get by just, reading through their primer chronologically in a one-room schoolhouse, because technology allows the teacher to customize the curriculum to the student. And sometimes the teacher doesn't even have to get involved. The way a lot of the ed tech that's emerging functions is it uses either machine learning or artificial intelligence to customize each lesson based on the child's progress through the previous lessons that they've completed. And Duolingo is a really good sort of tangible example that a lot of people have experienced to help understand the model. A lot of these tools are much more substantial academically than Duolingo is, but it's something that a lot of people have experienced, and so it gives a good frame of reference. When you log on to Duolingo for the first time and you say, I want to learn Spanish, for example, the very first thing that happens is you get a quiz on your Spanish knowledge. And maybe you took Spanish in high school and there's a lot that you don't remember, so you get some of the words in the questionnaire right, but not all of them. Duolingo takes that data and creates a base level of your understanding of the language. And it starts exactly where you are, and it starts feeding you new words based on the foundation that you already have. So it's building the next layer of blocks on top of what you already know. And each Duolingo lesson is 5 to 10 minutes of being introduced to new words, and you're engaging with them in different contexts. You're reading them, you're saying them, you're listening to them, you're translating them. And at the end of every single lesson, there's a short quiz. And that short quiz is gauging how much from that lesson you've retained. And the next lesson builds on the results of that quiz. So anything that you didn't get right, it puts in front of you again and again until you finally learned it. But it's also refreshing your memory by drawing on things that you learned in the past and forcing you to actively recall them after a spaced break. Like this learning technique is called spaced repetition. There's tons of research on why this works and how it helps reinforce the neurological pathways of learning in your brain. But the way the entire platform is structured is around your individual learning progress. So it's highly, highly customized to you. And if you're learning something very quickly, it'll move you very quickly through the lessons. You don't have to spend a lot of time drilling things that you've already memorized. But if you're struggling with something, it'll bring it up again and again and insert it into the different lessons that it's creating for you, even while you're learning other things, until you've mastered it, and then you can move on. And most of these ed tech tools that are being developed operate on a very similar sort of premise where they gauge where a child is at and then they start feeding them new material one package at a time. And after each new learning, kids are engaging with some sort of quiz or test that's gauging their knowledge of how much they've actually retained, and then is automatically and instantaneously building another lesson based on the results of that quiz or test. And this allows students to move at exactly their own pace, but to move in a way that is completely customized to their learning experience and to their mastery of the subject, rather than just moving through one lesson at a time, maybe retaining some of it, but not all of it, which is one of the big flaws of the institutional education model, where kids are forced to move at a collective pace. As a teacher, you're kind of forced to move your students through their lessons at sort of the average pace of 30 kids. And so some kids are inherently going to be ahead and bored, and some kids are inherently going to be behind and struggling. But you have to move the kids through the lessons chronologically and on a certain pace to ensure that you get through everything by the end of the year. And kids have retained enough information to get a passing grade, which is, in a lot of classrooms, of 60 to 70%. So they could theoretically miss 30 to 40% of the material and still technically pass and move on to the next grade level, which is wrought with its own set of problems. Because when you go in and you look at the data of how many kids are actually able to do math at grade level for different grades across different states across the country, it's shockingly bad how many kids are struggling. And a big part of why is because they're never mastering the things that they're learning. They're moving one step at a time through a curriculum, going through the motions of doing all the work, but not necessarily understanding, let alone retaining all of the material, which makes it progressively harder and harder as you move through grade levels to master the next set of material. Because, think about math as an example. Math is extremely iterative and it builds upon itself. So if you don't understand long division, or you had a really hard time with percentages, you're going to really struggle when you get to pre-algebra, because these things that you learned in lower level math are prerequisites to be able to do the work of pre-algebra, algebra, geometry, trigonometry. If you didn't understand these basic concepts, you're going to struggle very badly with the higher level materials. And so kids struggle terribly with mathematics, and it's not necessarily because they aren't inherently bad at math. And it's not even necessarily that the progression or like a lot of the material was wrong. It's that they're moving through things at a pace that is not their own, and they're not mastering the materials. And so they are trying to build a skyscraper on a porous foundation, which is generally a bad idea in the architectural world and also in the world of learning. And this is systemically a problem across any institutional education model, because these schools are inherently forced to move kids at a collective pace because it's the only way the model works. Whereas a more self-directed educational model is often using things like AI tools or learning apps to deliver some of the academic materials, which ends up leading to better academic results because each kid is working at their own pace. So in terms of academics, this means that often a more self-directed model where either the classroom is smaller and the teacher can give more individualized attention and has the freedom and the incentives to customize the curriculum wherever necessary to cater to the needs of each individual child, or where technology tools are being implemented that allow kids to move through curricular materials at their own pace, the academic results tend to be significantly better in a student-centric learning environment, which is really important because the stated goal of school is to deliver academic outcomes. And if your kid is struggling academically, they're probably going to struggle in life because a lot of what you learn in the classroom, yes, there are tons of things that you learn that are completely irrelevant and unnecessary. And that is a topic for a different conversation. But a lot of the things that you're learning, especially the core subjects, are really important. It's a sort of buy-in for the rest of life. You need to have strong reading and comprehension skills in order to be able to engage with the information that's available to you for the rest of your life and to be able to understand it and integrate it and use it. And mathematical skills are really important for a lot of the tasks that you complete throughout your life. And if you don't master the skills, you're going to struggle in all of the downstream places where these skills were supposed to be helping you, but the system failed you in teaching them to you adequately. And so if academic success is one of the core goals of school, which it kind of is the whole point, then you want to choose an option for your kid that enables them to actually be academically successful. And part of the problem is that while actual test scores are trending downwards, they've never been good, but they've gotten progressively worse. There's a strange phenomenon of grade inflation where grades don't actually match test scores. And so your kid can be scoring all A's or A's and B's, and you think that they're doing great in school, and yet they still don't actually understand the material at grade level because the classes are being graded on a curve and the standards of grading are changing. And so sometimes even the indicators that parents are watching for are actually misleading. But it's not just about the academics because there are so many other things that school is teaching your kid, both directly and intentionally and also indirectly. And school is one of the inputs of a number of things that are supposed to be working in concert to bring your kid to their adulthood as someone who is ready to go out into the world and be an independent and functioning adult. And there are a lot of things at play besides academic mastery, things like your child's self-esteem, their socialization skills, their psychological well-being, their sense of self, their perceptions of how they interact with other people and how they interact with the world, their level of proactiveness. When they run into a problem, do they look to someone for help? Do they ask for help when they need it? Are they comfortable doing that? Do they look to an authority figure for instructions? Are they self-directed problem solvers? And a lot of this stems from the things that a child learns over the course of their childhood, much of which is spent in school. And one of the big differentiators between a child-centric education and an institutional education is how each approach treats the child. And there's a quote that I think is a relevant metaphor for thinking about this. And that quote is, "One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." And the same is true with a child's education when you start thinking on a broad scale. One child struggling in school, struggling with their self-esteem, struggling academically, thinking they just are too stupid to ever understand math is a tragedy. When you talk to that child, you want to do everything in your power to fix it for that individual. But when you look at national statistics or even statewide statistics and you see, a million students are struggling to read at grade level, that's just a statistic. And it becomes a numbers problem. And it becomes a logistics issue of figuring out how you move pieces around to improve academic outcomes by, a percentage. And it's very hard to make sweeping changes that actually impact each individual child. And teachers do the best they can inside of the system, but there are limitations to how much they can move things around inside the confines of a classroom and the structure of a broad academic institution. Whereas in a smaller learning environment, often the entire emphasis by nature of being student centric is on the autonomy and the responsibility of the child. And so from the onset, kids are being given opportunities to be self-directed, to make decisions about how they're going to spend their day, how they're going to divide up their schoolwork, how they're going to choose what to work on next. And that level of self-direction develops a very high sense of self-esteem and self-direction very quickly. But it also allows the teacher to make far more customized interventions for the child based on that child's individual needs. And that tends to lead to results where kids coming out of these more innovative models often have higher levels of self-direction and self-esteem and self-efficacy because they've been given the chance to develop those things. And at the end of the day, a lot of kids move into adulthood with a general distaste for learning because they had such an unpleasant experience in the classroom. And a lot of the time, that's because they've only ever experienced learning as a coercive thing. They have to study for this test. They have to write this essay. They have to work on this part of the book next, even though their innate curiosities are pulling them in a different direction. And eventually they have to learn how to just sort of dull out those innate curiosities altogether because they're never being satiated and there's no time for them. And they're sort of being treated as a inconvenient distraction. Whereas kids in more child-centric learning environments get to choose what they're working on. And so by choosing what they're working on, they're allowed the freedom to really nurture and cultivate the things within them that they're curious about. They're given the chance to see how the academic things that they're working on connect back to the other interests in their lives, how the things that they're learning are actually relevant to them and meaningful. And it allows their curiosity and creativity to remain intact in ways that it's much harder to do inside the grinding gears of an institution that needs the whole system to keep functioning in order to survive. And the needs of an individual child are sort of being catered to at average, but not on the individual level. These are, I think, the most important distinctions between different education models. Obviously, there are tons of different programs that fall under each umbrella, but I think this sort of student-centric framework is when I'm talking to parents about choosing a school option, that's generally what I'm advising to look for. Look for something where the child has the maximum amount of responsibility and autonomy possible, a model that respects the individual child, that allows for curricular customization for that child, that allows that child as much space as possible to be making decisions for themselves very early about what they're working on and how they're approaching it. And there are tons of different things that fall under that umbrella, things like Montessori schools, micro schools, different types of innovative entrepreneurial learning environments, things like Acton Academy and Alpha School and Apogee. There are tons and tons of programs like this. And also parents can deliver it themselves through homeschooling. But I think the landscape of different education choices feels very disparate as a parent when you're looking at it for the first time. When you start to see it as different categories of things and different sort of philosophies of approach, then you can start looking at different schools through the lens of, I'm looking for something that's child centric, and then I'm looking for the thing that's the right culture fit for my kid. And that's a really personal thing. Some kids really thrive in the structure of Montessori. Other kids do much better in a play-based school or a forest school or something that allows them to be wild and rambunctious and free. Some kids love Waldorf. Other kids thrive much more in a more STEMmy or hands-on project-based learning environment. But I think the most important thing truly is that the philosophy of student-centric is there. because within that sort of philosophical approach, that reverence for the child and the development of the child, your child is able to follow the path that best serves them. And in my opinion, the specifics of the dressing and details of the school matter less than the philosophical approach at the root. All right, there's lots more to talk about with this, but that's what I'm going to leave you with today. We will be revisiting all of this and lots more when I am back from break. I will see you guys all very soon. In the meantime, have a great rest of your week, have a great weekend, and I will talk to you soon.